What if I told you that a man once built the very coffin his master would die in, without ever carving a lid, without ever shaping it as such? What if I told you that a piece of furniture, a bed, could whisper at night, not with creaks of age, but with the sound of breath, breath belonging to someone who should have been buried long before? This is not rumor. This is not folklore softened by time. This is Alabama in the 1840s, where slavery fed the earth like rot, and where silence itself became a weapon sharper than any blade. The Fairweather plantation was a wound on the land, wide and festering, a monument to greed dressed in cotton and blood. The house stood high, proud, its walls painted to conceal decay, its halls echoing with laughter from men who believed themselves gods. And beneath that house, in the fields and sheds, lived the true architects of its grandeur, men and women who were forbidden names, forbidden choices, forbidden the dignity of mourning. Among them was Joram, a carpenter. He was not the sort of man who filled silence with groans or curses. No, his silence was his rebellion, his discipline. He carried wood as if it were sacred, not raw material, but living history. Each joint he carved, each motif he pressed into walnut and oak, carried memory older than America itself, patterns that belonged to rivers he no longer saw, to ancestors who spoke languages forbidden to his tongue. His master, Jeremiah Fairweather, believed those shapes were decoration, meaningless flourishes from a hand born to serve. But Joram knew better. What the master slept on each night was not a bed, it was a shrine. 4 posts rising like pillars of judgment, entwined with patterns Jeremiah would never decode. That bed was Joram's art, his devotion, his prayer. But it would not remain a prayer. For Joram had a wife, Ebe, taken into the house after her last child did not survive. Her voice, once a hymn in the quarters, had gone brittle, splintered. She belonged to silence now, the kind of silence that does not rest, but waits. And one night, while Jeremiah Fairweather lay sprawled across the carved walnut bed, Ebe's hand lingered on its frame, warm, warmer than wood should be. She knew then Joram's work was not finished. The master's coffin had already been built. He was sleeping in it. The story of Joram does not end with his death. No, his silence only deepened. One morning, the overseer claimed he had fallen on his tools, as if blood could spill so neatly, as if a shirt could fold itself across a sawhorse like a shroud. His body was never found. Only absence remained, a hollow space heavier than flesh, and in that absence, Ebe began to change. She no longer wept, she no longer sang. Her face became still, carved like the very wood her husband once shaped. In the quarters, the other women kept their distance, not out of fear, but respect. They recognized that something ancient had entered her silence, something older than grief, older than chains. They had seen it before in the old women who whispered prayers in tongues they were forbidden to speak. The spirit of endurance, sharpened into retribution. The house did not notice, at least not at first. Jeremiah Fairweather stumbled through his nights drunk on bourbon, his laughter echoing through halls that reeked of sweat and cruelty. He barked orders at Ebe as if she were furniture, and she obeyed, polishing the very bed he lay upon. Her hands moved steady, smoothing sheets, oiling joints, whispering words in silence. She never hurried, she never faltered. But something was happening. The bed began to change. At night, it groaned, not with the shifting of weight, but with the sound of wood remembering. The master dismissed it as damp weather. He ordered her to oil the joints. She did, but not with the overseer's oil. She mixed her own, laced with herbs her grandmother had taught her to recognize in the riverside before ships came. With each rub of cloth against timber, she was not preserving the bed, she was feeding it, awakening it. Fairweather's dreams grew darker. He muttered of hands clutching his ankles in the night, of heat pressing upon his chest, of voices speaking in tongues he could not name. He drank more, shouted more, but he aged, too. Wrinkles deepened, his steps slowed, and still the bed groaned beneath him, restless as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. And Ebe listened. She studied. She measured. Each day she returned to the shed where Joram's tools had once hung. Each day she placed her hands where his had been. Each day she learned. For the bed was not just a bed anymore. It was a door. The autumn of 1840 crept slow across Alabama, dragging the fields into pale exhaustion. Cotton rotted on stalks that had been picked too many times, and the air thickened with mildew and memory. Yet inside the house, change brewed more quietly, more deliberately, within the bed carved from Joram's hands. Ebe had begun to treat that bed as others might treat an altar. Each morning, before Fairweather stirred, she pressed her palms against the frame, not to clean, but to listen. The wood answered faintly, like a pulse beneath the surface. At first it was subtle, a warmth that lingered, a faint echo when she tapped the slats. But soon, the responses grew bolder. A long, low groan when Fairweather rolled onto his side. A sharp creak when his weight pressed deep. She was certain then, the bed was no longer passive. It was remembering. In secret, Ebe worked in the old storage room where Joram's chisels still rested. No one cared for tools left behind by a dead man, but to her, they were relics. With them, she retraced the designs her husband once carved. The spirals, the cross-hatchings, the symbols Fairweather could never decipher. She found in them the bones of a hidden design, compartments, hinges, panels that could open where none appeared. This was not furniture. This was a device, a vessel. The whispers spread in the quarters. Some said they had seen Joram's shadow crossing the fields at dusk. Others claimed they felt his hand guiding theirs as they worked. No body, no grave, no proof, only signs. And in slavery, signs were everything. They believed Joram's spirit had not gone into the soil, but into the wood. Fairweather did not notice Ebe's hours in the shed. He did not notice the way she oiled the bed frame with mixtures of resin, ash, and crushed herbs that burned faintly when touched by fire. But he noticed the dreams. He spoke of sinking, always sinking, into the mattress as if the bed itself wanted him deeper. He woke sweating, gasping, muttering of doors closing above him. Ebe never soothed him. She only stood silent at the edge of the room, her hands folded. Inside, though, her resolve was sharpening. She had seen what Joram's hands had left behind. She had learned where the wood was hollow, where the frame could bend, where the master would not rise if the bed decided otherwise. The coffin was not being built. It was already here. It was waiting. The nights grew heavier. Thunder rolled low over the Alabama plains, and the Fairweather house seemed to sag beneath its own weight. Jeremiah Fairweather staggered through his evenings bloated with bourbon, but his sleep no longer carried rest. He tossed and turned upon the carved walnut frame, muttering in fever, as though something unseen pressed upon him. The bed groaned beneath him, not with age, but with hunger. At first, he dismissed it as the folly of dreams, but the dreams deepened. He spoke of hands gripping his wrists, of a breath that did not belong to him filling his chest. One night he woke shrieking, swearing he felt the mattress opening, drawing him down into a pit of suffocating heat. The overseer laughed it off, claiming whiskey makes cowards of even strong men. But Ebe did not laugh. She listened. She watched. She had begun to whisper to the wood, not prayers, commands, words older than the plantation, older than chains, words her grandmother had murmured when fires burned low by the riverbanks of her youth. The language was fractured in her throat, yet the wood responded. The frame shivered beneath her palm. Sometimes, when she turned down the sheets, she swore the bed exhaled, slow and deliberate, as though something living breathed inside. Fairweather's temper grew black. He struck the house slaves more often, snapped at the overseer, drank before noon. The cotton fields still bled white, but his grip on the land trembled. What frightened him most was not rebellion, Not whispers of spirits, but the sound of his own bed at night, the creak of joints when no one moved, the steady pulse of warmth that lingered after he rose. He cursed Joram's craftsmanship, swore the man had left curses in the grain. He threatened to burn the thing, but when he ordered Ibi to prepare kerosene, his hands froze at the frame. He could not touch it. His body refused. In the quarters, whispers thickened. Joram's spirit was near. Some swore they heard tapping inside the bed frame, rhythmic, deliberate, like a carpenter's hammer against hidden joints. Others claimed the symbols Joram had carved were changing, shifting in the candlelight, as if letters no white man could read were arranging themselves into messages. And Ibi, silent as stone, began her true work. By day, she polished. By night, she altered. The frame's underside grew hollow, reinforced, reshaped with hidden latches. She was not just tending the master's bed. She was building a chamber, a trap, a coffin that closed from within. The house had become a tomb, waiting to be sealed. The storm arrived without mercy. Rain lashed the Fairweather house like a scourge, rattling shutters and swelling the swollen red clay beneath its foundations. The air inside the chambers smelled of wet wood and sour whiskey, but it was the bed that held the night's true weight. Its frame pulsed with a damp animal warmth, as though the storm outside had bled into the grain itself. Fairweather stumbled into the room late, soaked to the bone, his boots caked in mud from shouting at men too weary to pick in the rain. His fury boiled. He cursed Joram's name, spat that the bed was cursed, a devil's trick. Yet when he dropped upon the mattress, it welcomed him with a softness too deep, too willing. His body sank, and the frame sang, a long groan, half wood, half voice. Ibi lingered at the doorway, holding the taper. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The storm spoke for her, rattling the panes, hiding the sounds the house would soon make. She watched Fairweather twitch, his chest rising and falling shallow, as if something pressed down on it. His arms jerked, his mouth opened, and a guttural cry clawed out, muffled halfway. He wasn't alone in that bed anymore. The mattress rippled. It was no trick of lightning. The frame bent in ways wood should not bend, curving inward, swallowing weight. The carved spirals seemed to rotate, inch by inch, drawing in the eye. Fairweather thrashed now, his hands clawing at the sheets, but his wrists stuck fast, as though the wood itself had grown fingers to clutch him. Ibi stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the floorboards. The taper flame wavered, but her voice did not. She whispered the old words, syllables cracked and half-forgotten, yet heavy with power. The bed answered, its groans becoming rhythm, its joints tightening with purpose. Fairweather screamed her name, at first in command, then in terror. His legs disappeared. Red first, pulled down where no cavity had ever existed. The sound was wet, suffocating, as though the frame had become soil. His fists beat against the posts, splintering skin, but the bed absorbed him, inch by inch. His chest vanished, his shoulders, his throat convulsing against the pull. His last cry was cut short as the headboard opened like jaws and closed again with a crack of finality. Silence. Only rain on the roof, only the shudder of a house too old to care. Ibi lowered the taper and touched the frame. It was warm, pulsing steady as a living thing. Joram was not gone. Joram had taken his due. The master's bed had become his coffin. Morning broke gray and swollen, the fields slick with mud, the air carrying the smell of wet earth and rot. But in the master's house, a deeper rot had taken root. Jeremiah Fairweather was gone. His boots remained by the door. His coat hung sodden across a chair. And yet no one could find him. The overseer cursed, stomping through the quarters, demanding answers. He accused men of running him off, of hiding him in the woods, of plotting mutiny. But no one had seen Fairweather leave. No lantern had flickered across the yard. No hoofbeats carried into the storm. The only sound had been the thunder, and the only witness was the bed that still groaned faintly when touched. The house servants whispered among themselves. Some said Fairweather had drunk himself into a ditch. Others dared to claim the swamp had swallowed him whole. But Eby knew the truth. She kept her lips pressed tight, her eyes lowered, even as the overseer's questions cut sharper. She moved about the house in silence, polishing the frame that still pulsed faintly under her cloth. Each time her fingers brushed the carved spirals, the wood answered. It was not just warm now, it was fed. Days stretched thin. Without Fairweather's lash, the overseer's bark lost bite. The cotton lay uncollected, the ledgers blank. The quarters filled with rumor, wild, dangerous rumor. Joram had risen. His spirit had returned. Some swore they had seen him in the fields at night, his shadow long and bent, hammer in hand, tapping against trees as if testing the grain. Others whispered that the bed itself now breathed, that if one laid an ear against the headboard, they could hear muffled cries still echoing inside. Fear shifted into something sharper, hope. For the first time, the enslaved whispered openly of freedom. If the master could vanish into his own house, what else could vanish? Chains? Overseers? The plantation itself? The air trembled with a new courage, unspoken, but alive. Yet danger thickened just as quickly. Riders came from the neighboring farms, men armed with muskets and suspicion. They demanded to search, to find the body, to lay blame, but no body could be found. The earth had swallowed nothing. The swamp had hidden no one, only the bed remained, standing tall in its place, its polished frame shining darkly in the candlelight. And in that silence, Eby's resolve hardened. Joram was not finished. The wood was not done. One man gone was not enough. The land itself would demand more blood before it slept. The Fairweather house no longer belonged to the living. By the second week, its silence had grown so oppressive that even the dogs refused to linger near its porch. The neighbors who came to investigate left with unease in their eyes, though none dared admit it. They spoke of foul play, of runaways conspiring, of Fairweather himself hiding from debts or enemies. But in their pauses, in their lowered voices, another truth hovered. The bed. Always the bed. One evening, a neighbor named Harlan Price insisted on sleeping in the master's chamber. He was a man swollen with arrogance, one who believed fear itself could be beaten out of others. He scoffed at the whispers, spat at the talk of curses, and threw himself across the walnut frame, daring any spirit to drag him down. The house servants stood frozen at the threshold, their lanterns shaking in hand. Eby alone met his gaze, her silence heavier than any word. At first the night seemed uneventful. Harlan's snores echoed down the hall like the grumble of a hog. But past midnight, the air thickened. The walls dampened with sweat, though no fire burned. The bed frame began its groan, soft and patient, like a hinge slowly bending. The spiral carvings gleamed with an oily sheen, as though sweat poured from the wood itself. Harlan stirred. His snore cut short, his body shifted. A low grunt slipped from his throat. Then another. He sat upright, wild-eyed, clawing at his chest as if the weight of the air itself pressed down upon him. The servants outside heard the thump of fists against wood, the scrape of heels digging into sheets. When they rushed in, lanterns lifted, they found him struggling, half his legs already gone, swallowed by the mattress. His hands clawed at the posts, his face purple with terror. The bed was feeding again. One servant dropped his lantern in horror. The glass shattered, and fire licked across the walls. Floorboards. But before flame could spread, Eby stepped forward, calm as stone. She pressed her palm to the frame and whispered low, the same broken syllables her grandmother once taught her. The wood shuddered and tightened its grip. Harlan's scream broke into choking silence as the headboard cracked open like a throat and sealed itself again. When it was done, the room was still, save for the faint pulsing under the frame, steady as a heart newly fed. The neighbors fled at dawn. None would speak of what they'd seen, but their eyes told the truth. The house was cursed. No man who entered that bed would leave it. And in the quarters, whispers turned to plans. If the bed could devour masters, perhaps it could devour the whole order that bound them. Perhaps Joram's vengeance was not just for himself, but for all of them. By the close of autumn, the Fairweather plantation was a hollowed husk of its former cruelty. The cotton rotted in the fields, unpicked, heavy with mildew. The overseer had fled under cover of night, muttering of shadows that followed him between the rows. Neighbors no longer rode up the road. The house itself had become a wound on the land, festering, avoided even by the crows. Only the enslaved remained, and they no longer bent their backs in silence. In the master's chamber, the bed pulsed like something alive. Its carvings shimmered with oil, its joints breathed like lungs. Those who dared step too near swore they heard whispers beneath the wood, voices overlapping. Joram, Fairweather, Harlan, and others unnamed, bound together in a chorus of muffled grief and rage. Eby stood before it nightly, her hair streaked with ash, her hands steady as she traced the spirals. She had become priestess, keeper, judge. One night, when the moon burned red through the swollen sky, Eby gathered them all, the men and women who had once been chained by Fairweather's hand. They crowded into the house, silent, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Eby spoke little. She simply laid her palm against the bedframe, and the wood responded, groaning deep as the earth itself. The spiral shifted. Panels unseen swung open, revealing hollow chambers lined with nails and splinters. It was not just a coffin, it was a maw. The people did not flee. They stepped forward. Some touched the frame, whispering names of those lost, children sold south, husbands whipped dead, mothers buried nameless in shallow graves. With each name, the wood shook harder, drinking their grief, swelling with their rage. The air cracked like a storm about to break. And then it did. The house groaned, beams snapping, floorboards warping, as though the bed's hunger had spread through the bones of the mansion itself. Windows shattered inward, glass spraying like rain. The very roof sagged as though dragged down by invisible hands. The Fairweather house had become the coffin. By dawn, nothing stood but blackened timber and a field of smoke. Where the master's chamber had been, only a mound of ash and warped walnut remained, pulsing faintly before sinking silent into the soil. The people walked away without chains, without overseers, without masters. Behind them, the land still whispered, as if Joram's spirit lingered, not haunting, but watching. The bed was gone, but its work was finished. Fairweather's house had consumed itself, and with it, the order that bound the people to the earth. Freedom had not been granted. It had been carved, piece by piece, from wood and blood and vengeance.